You know Paul McCartney, the cheeky Beatle with the bass line so smooth they practically smiled at you. Yesterday, charmed half the planet, got knighted. But while Paul's public image is all peace signs and polite interviews, the man's got a razor-sharp radar for music he can't stand. And when he doesn't like a band, oh, he really doesn't like them. Some of the names on that list, not who you'd expect. Let's talk about the 6 bands that made McCartney go from mellow to merciless. 5. The Rolling Stones. Blues cover band, the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. It's been packaged for decades as a friendly rivalry, like 2 heavyweight champs giving each other polite nods across the ring. But once you peel back the PR smiles and joint photo ops, the truth is, Paul McCartney never really bought the whole bromance act. To Paul, the Stones were always just behind. Not talentless, but always playing catch-up. Privately, he didn't hold back. Producer George Martin once revealed that during a late-night Abbey Road session in 1968, Paul casually referred to the Stones as a blues cover band that got lucky. Just a throwaway line for Paul, but it stuck. Not the kind of thing you'd ever hear in a rock doc, but definitely the kind of comment that shows where Paul really stood. And decades later, he still felt the same. In a 2021 New Yorker interview, McCartney threw that same jab out into the world again, said the Stones were, quote, a blues cover band, then added, our net was cast a bit wider than theirs, which in Paul speak is the polite version of, we invented modern rock, those guys just copied Muddy Waters and ran with it. Naturally, Mick Jagger didn't take it lying down. He clapped back in classic Jagger fashion, calling the Beatles a 4-piece band with 1 drummer. Subtle but entertaining, absolutely. But the tension wasn't just about genre. Paul believed the Stones were consistently lifting creative cues from the Beatles. According to Peter Brown, a former Apple Records executive, Paul always felt the Stones had a habit of trailing their artistic innovations by a few months, copying album formats, psychedelic themes, even fashion shifts after the Beatles had already broken new ground. Need an example? The Stones' Their Satanic Majesty's Request came out just months after Sgt. Pepper and looked suspiciously similar in both sound and cover art. Fans noticed, so did Paul. And unlike Ringo, he wasn't chill about it. It even got personal in 1969 when John Lennon briefly considered producing a Stones album. That suggestion hit Paul like a betrayal. According to engineer Jeff Emmerich, Paul wasn't just annoyed, he was furious. Said something along the lines of, why waste your time polishing their songs when we've got Beatles tracks that need finishing? Even when Paul tried to be diplomatic, the edge slipped through. In a 2016 Rolling Stone interview, when asked about the whole Beatles-Stones rivalry, his response sounded friendly. Until the end. He said, they're a great band, but they're just not the Beatles, are they? And that are they? That's Paul's version of twisting the knife with a smile on his face. Now, let's be fair, Paul has praised the Stones here and there. He's acknowledged their energy, their staying power, and even said once that Jumpin' Jack Flash is a brilliant track. But those compliments always feel carefully measured, like he's reading from a card that says, say something nice but not too nice. Because deep down, Paul's always seen the Beatles as the blueprint, and in his view, the Stones. They were the loud kids in the back who copied the answers and still got famous. And honestly, that probably annoyed the hell out of him. 4. The Sex Pistols. Punk rebellion versus pop royalty. If there's one sound that made Paul McCartney physically wince, it was punk rock, and no one represented that anti-everything attitude louder or messier than the Sex Pistols. For Paul, punk wasn't just a genre, it was a full-blown rebellion against everything he'd spent his career building. Melody, gone. Musical skill, optional. Harmony, not even on the menu. The Sex Pistols didn't want to be the next Beatles. They wanted to blow the Beatles up and throw the pieces into the crowd. Linda McCartney's brother, John Eastman, once said Paul found their music an assault on his ears. And you can picture it, right? A man who spent hours layering strings and writing airtight chord progressions, now listening to Anarchy in the UK. It must have felt like a Molotov cocktail through Abbey Road studios. But the venom ran both ways. Johnny Rotten called Paul a dinosaur in interviews, accusing him of being part of the establishment punk was trying to torch. And Sid Vicious? He didn't even bother with subtlety. When they crossed paths at London's AIR studios, Paul reportedly walked over to say hello, and Sid mumbled something about sellouts. Paul didn't even respond, just turned and walked away. And then there's the Beatles poster story. According to Wings drummer Denny Sywell, the Pistols were using Beatles memorabilia for target practice during rehearsals. Paul tried to play it cool, laughed, shrugged, but his jaw clenched. And yeah, you could tell it hit him right in the ego. Decades later, during a BBC interview, Paul was asked again about the Pistols. His reply, a tight little shrug and 4 frosty words, "Not my cup of tea." Translation: I've never liked them. I don't respect them. And no, I don't think God Save the Queen was clever, because if there's one thing Paul McCartney can't fake, it's respect for music he considers chaos wearing a safety pin. Yath 3. Oasis. Beatles worship gone wrong. Oasis didn't just admire the Beatles, they practically treated them like a religion. Their entire Britpop identity was wrapped in Lennon shades, vintage guitars, and a messianic belief that they were the second coming of rock royalty. You'd think Paul McCartney might have been flattered. These were guys who worshipped his every chord progression. Noel Gallagher once said he'd trade every Oasis song just to have written Blackbird. That's not admiration, that's borderline fan fiction. But for Paul, the novelty wore off fast. What started as flattery began to feel like theft. Behind the scenes, he found their obsession tiresome and borderline insulting, according to longtime publicist Jeff Baker. At one dinner with George Martin, Paul reportedly leaned in and said, "They've got the swagger right, but where's the innovation?" To him, Oasis were like Beatles cosplay. All the attitude, none of the evolution. Then Noel pulled a classic Gallagher move, declared that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles. Cue McCartney's internal scream. Beatles biographer Philip Norman said Paul straight up called the comparison ridiculous, not even worth dignifying. And then came the awkward award show moment. The 2000 Q Awards. Liam Gallagher, loud, brash, mid-reinvention, tried to ask Paul for an autograph. Paul gave him a smile colder than Abbey Road pavement and walked away. Polite? Barely. Enthusiastic? Not even close. In public, Paul kept things civil. No name-calling, no Twitter rants. But when GQ asked about Oasis in 2018, all he said was, "Good songs. Wish they'd found their own voice." Which, let's be honest, is McCartney code for "nice try. Now go do your homework without copying mine." That's the thing with Paul. He respects originality. He'll spar with a worthy rival. But if he thinks you're just recycling his legacy and calling it new, yeah, he's not giving you a hug and a handshake. He's giving you that look. 2. The Bee Gees, falsettos and fumes. By the late 70s, disco was king. Mirror balls, platform shoes, and bass lines you could roller skate to. And right in the glittering heart of it all, the Bee Gees. Barry, Robin, and Morris were everywhere, soundtracking dance floors, dominating the charts, and turning Saturday Night Fever into a global phenomenon. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney was kind of stuck. Post-Wings, his solo momentum was slowing down. He wasn't flopping, but he definitely wasn't soaring. And watching 3 falsetto-loving brothers sell records like hotcakes while the former Beatles struggled to stay musically relevant. Yeah, that stung. Producer Chris Thomas once said, Paul felt blindsided by disco. It wasn't just a shift in sound, it felt like a whole generation moving on without him. And it didn't help that the Bee Gees had started off with a distinctly Beatles-esque style before jumping ship to disco. To Paul, that wasn't evolution, that was selling out. Wings guitarist Lawrence Juba remembered Paul visibly groaning when Bee Gees tracks played in the studio. One time he muttered, "Same 3 chords, sped up, with falsetto and a drum machine." Not exactly glowing praise. It got extra frosty in 1979. Both Paul and the Bee Gees were recording at the same Miami studio, but Paul started scheduling his sessions around theirs just to avoid running into them. That's not passive-aggressive, that's just aggressive. And when someone casually mentioned that the Bee Gees had broken yet another Beatles record, Paul didn't argue. He just stared, nodded once, and said nothing. 1. The Beach Boys. Pet sounds, pet peeves. Of all McCartney's musical rivalries, this one cut the deepest. The tension with the Beach Boys wasn't just about sales or chart positions, it was personal. Because Paul didn't just compete with Brian Wilson, he studied him. It all started with Pet Sounds. In 1966, Paul got his hands on an advance copy, and it hit him like a tidal wave. He was stunned, played it over and over, told anyone who'd listen it was the best album ever made. But that admiration came with a challenge. Paul wasn't going to sit back and clap. He immediately set out to top it. And that's where Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came from. Straight up, it was Paul's attempt to out-Brian Brian. And he nearly did. Producer George Martin later said Paul combed through Pet Sounds like a chess grandmaster dissecting an opponent's moves. He wasn't just inspired, he was threatened. Every harmony, every arrangement, Paul wanted to crack the code and raise the stakes, but the friendly game turned bitter. When Brian Wilson buckled under the pressure of his follow-up album, Smile, Paul wasn't exactly warm. Beatles road manager Mal Evans recalled Paul saying, "If you can't finish what you start, maybe you shouldn't be in this business." That's not critique, that's a gut punch. Things only got colder after a now infamous 1967 dinner party at Brian's place. Paul casually dismissed several Beach Boys tracks as a bit too predictable. Brian didn't speak for days. The guy who once inspired him was now dismantling his work over red wine and salad. Even decades later, Paul's praise came laced with qualifiers. Yes, he called God Only Knows a perfect song, but he couldn't resist the footnotes. Perfect. For American pop. Of that time, always that little distance. Music historian David Leaf probably said it best. Paul respects Brian's work, but he'll never fully admit how much it pushed him. And that's the thing. McCartney won't let himself say it out loud, but you can tell, this rivalry, it never really left him. So yeah, turns out even the nicest Beatle had a bit of a blacklist. These weren't just petty squabbles. Each of these feuds says something about Paul's standards, his ego, and just how seriously he takes music. He's polite in public, but when it comes to bands stepping on his creative turf, the man remembers. Which one surprised you the most? Think Paul was being petty or just painfully honest? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're ready for the debate. If you liked this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell. More untold music stories are coming your way, and some of them might just rewrite what you thought you knew.